Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most complex and divisive conflicts of the 20th century, the Vietnam War. This wasn't just a war fought in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It was a conflict that tore nations apart, reshaped global politics, and left scars that are still felt today. So, grab a seat, and let's try to understand how and why this all happened. To truly get a grip on the Vietnam War, we have to rewind the clock, way before the 1950s. For centuries, Vietnam was under Chinese rule, and later, in the 19th century, it became a colony of France, part of what was known as French Indochina. The Vietnamese people had a long history of fighting for their independence. During World War II, Japan occupied Vietnam. It was during this time that a revolutionary leader, Ho Chi Minh, founded the Viet Minh, a nationalist movement aimed at liberating Vietnam from all foreign control. After Japan's defeat in 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam an independent nation, but the French weren't ready to let go of their colony. They returned, sparking the First Indochina War, which lasted for nearly a decade. The Viet Minh, using guerrilla tactics, fought fiercely. The conflict reached a critical turning point in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where the French forces suffered a devastating defeat. This loss was a massive blow to French morale and their political will to continue the war. Following the French defeat, the Geneva Accords were signed in 1954. These agreements temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The North, under the communist leadership of Ho Chi Minh, was called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, with its capital in Hanoi. The South, known as the Republic of Vietnam, was established as a non-communist state, eventually led by Ngo Dinh Diem and backed by the United States, with its capital in Saigon. The plan was to hold a nationwide election in 1956 to reunify the country, but this election never happened. Why? Well, this was the height of the Cold War. The United States was deeply committed to its policy of containment, which meant stopping the spread of communism at all costs. They feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in Southeast Asia would follow, like a row of falling dominoes. This was the domino theory. So, the U.S. supported the anti-communist government in South Vietnam, even though its leader Ngo Dinh Diem was becoming increasingly unpopular, autocratic, and repressive. Diem refused to hold the reunification elections, fearing that Ho Chi Minh would win by a landslide. This decision laid the groundwork for the Second Indochina War, or what we commonly call the Vietnam War. In the South, opposition to Diem's government grew. Many Southerners who wanted a unified, independent Vietnam, including communists, formed a resistance group known as the National Liberation Front, or the Viet Cong. Supplied and supported by North Vietnam, the Viet Cong began a guerrilla war against the South Vietnamese government. Initially, the U.S. role was limited. They sent military advisors and financial aid to support the South Vietnamese army. But as the Viet Cong gained more ground, American involvement deepened. A pivotal moment came in August 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The U.S. claimed that its naval destroyer, the USS Maddox, was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. While the details of this event are still debated by historians, it was the trigger the U.S. government needed. The U.S. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. This resolution opened the floodgates. In 1965, the U.S. began a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, known as Operation Rolling Thunder. At the same time, the first American combat troops arrived, marking the start of a massive escalation. By 1968, over 500,000 American soldiers were stationed in Vietnam. The fighting was brutal and unlike anything American soldiers had experienced before. They were fighting a conventional army in the North Vietnamese Army (NVA) and simultaneously a guerrilla force in the Viet Cong. The enemy was often indistinguishable from the civilian population. They fought in dense jungles, rice paddies, and complex tunnel systems. The U.S. relied heavily on its technological superiority, using helicopters for mobility and launching massive search and destroy missions. However, the Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics, knowledge of the terrain, and their unwavering determination made it a grueling and frustrating war of attrition. The goal for the U.S. wasn't to conquer North Vietnam, but to prop up the South and break the will of the North to continue fighting. Back home in America, the war was becoming increasingly unpopular. For the first time in history, the horrors of war were broadcast directly into people's living rooms every night on the television news. People saw the graphic images, the body counts, and the human cost of the conflict. A massive anti-war movement emerged, particularly among young people and on college campuses. Protests, draft card burnings, and marches became common. The country was deeply divided between the hawks who supported the war and the doves who demanded peace. The turning point of the war, both militarily and psychologically, came in January 1968 with the Tet Offensive. During the Vietnamese New Year holiday, or Tet, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launched a massive, coordinated surprise attack on dozens of cities and military bases across South Vietnam, including the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Militarily, the offensive was a failure for the North. They suffered huge casualties and didn't hold any of their targets for long. But politically, it was a stunning victory. It shattered the American public's belief that the war was being won and that the end was in sight. It proved that the enemy was far from defeated and could strike anywhere anytime. After the Tet Offensive, President Johnson announced he would not seek re-election, and peace talks began in Paris. His successor, Richard Nixon, was elected on a promise of peace with honor. His strategy was Vietnamization, a policy of gradually withdrawing U.S. troops while building up the South Vietnamese army to fight on its own. However, while withdrawing troops, Nixon also secretly expanded the war, ordering bombing campaigns in neighboring Cambodia and Laos to destroy enemy supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Finally, in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops, and the return of American prisoners of war. For the United States, the war was over. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March 1973. But for the Vietnamese, the fighting didn't stop. Without American support, the South Vietnamese army struggled to hold back the North. In the spring of 1975, North Vietnam launched a final, decisive offensive. The South Vietnamese government and army collapsed quickly. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, which was soon renamed Ho Chi Minh City. The war was finally over, and Vietnam was reunified under communist rule. The legacy of the Vietnam War is immense and heartbreaking. Over 58,000 Americans lost their lives. The number of Vietnamese casualties, both military and civilian, is estimated to be in the millions. The conflict left deep physical and psychological scars. Returning American veterans often faced public indifference or outright hostility, and many struggled with PTSD. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were devastated by years of bombing and conflict, and the after effects of chemical defoliants like Agent Orange continue to cause health problems to this day. The war also profoundly changed America. It eroded public trust in the government and military, led to the abolition of the military draft, and created a reluctance to commit U.S. troops to foreign conflicts, a sentiment that became known as the Vietnam Syndrome. The Vietnam War serves as a powerful and tragic lesson about the complexities of international relations, the limits of military power, and the profound human cost of conflict. It's a story of nationalism, ideology, and a generation caught in the crossfire. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a very difficult but important part of our history. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this. And as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next video.